Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast, where we talk about tools for making sense and meaning in turbulent times. I'm Boaz. I'm an entrepreneur and executive. I've been working in renewable energy for about 25 years. And now I mostly work with organizations on the quality of their thinking and their collaboration.
And welcome. I'm Brian. I'm a teacher, a artist, a creator, a builder, and a backyard philosopher. And welcome back, folks.
Cool. So, Brian, you wanted to make a quick comment before we dive in today.
Oh yeah, it's just a little correction. We were talking, I believe, in one of our previous episodes about the semantic world and the nature of transcendent experiences going beyond just the one brain sphere. And I think I made reference to one of the early Christian theologians who said, I believe it because it is absurd. In other words, because it transcends logic. And I wrestled for a while in that episode for a few seconds, trying to remember whether it was St. Anselm and St. Augustine. And I think I settled on St. Augustine. Well, it wasn't either of them. It was actually an early Christian theologian named Tertullian. And so I just wanted to put that out there. Tertullian's interesting because he's considered one of the first people that brought Latin into Christianity. And he was also one of the Christian theologians from Africa, from the Roman Northern Africa. So that's kind of an interesting little piece of history there. But it shows that dichotomy was there way back. He was like second century AD. So uh, so this is an early old idea, and I think he really had a a, a bug under his saddle for Gnosticism. So he was a big one that was fighting heretics and heresies and things like that back in those days. But
That's
anyway,
actually
so
on my list, not for today, but to come back to the Enneagram and Gnosticism is something that I think it might be interesting for us to talk about at some point.
for sure, for sure. But anyway, so that was just a correction I wanted to make. If anybody's curious and wants to follow that reference, uh, he was actually preceded Augustine.
Cool.
So
Thanks, Brian.
for sure.
Um, so I've got a topic today that isn't something that you've said to me many times, but it is something that we talked about once and it kind of stuck with me. And then it came up again for me recently. So let me just set it up and then let's see where it goes. So so you told me about how the samurai's sword, when it's in the sheath, is a representation of yin and yang in balance. The sword being yang and the sheath being yin. And so the only reason that the sword would ever come out of the sheath and become demonstrate an imbalance of yin and yang is to correct an external imbalance of yin and yang out in the world. And as soon as that imbalance is corrected, the sword goes back into its sheath.
Okay, I
And
told you that.
yeah,
Okay,
and it's
that's
a few
clever.
years ago. Yes, sometimes things stick with me. Um, but this came up for me a couple of ways recently. One is a friend of mine who's traveling the world has been texting me about, when is violence justified? And I've had kind of I used to think of myself as a pacifist, and that violence only begets more violence. And I guess as I've gotten older, I've become a little more of a realist and decided, well, sometimes maybe violence is necessary, but I don't know that I could make like a clear moral statement about when and like exactly where I stand there. And then I heard somebody say recently that all of politics, or really all of civilization, is a proxy for violence. That everything that we do to organize civilization is um, a papering over of our ability to be violent, and the imbalances in power relating to our capacity for violence are manifest in political power, um,
Sure.
which is pretty obvious, right? So I'm just kind of thinking about all these ideas in relationship to one another, and thought there might be something for us to play around with here.
Sure. Sure. Well, let's see. I mean, I can think of coming at this a few ways. Uh, Probably the quickest, briefest way is, the Freudian model. Freud said we have primary drives, we have secondary drives, and we have tertiary drives. So these primary drives are fundamental, and they are supportive of life. And in that model, when those drives get frustrated, they generate secondary drives. And secondary drives are always violent or always destructive in one way or the other. And then polite society runs functions because we have tertiary drives which hold down the eruption of these secondary drives, which are generated by frustrated primary drives. If that makes sense. Uh, I tend to look at things like, and this is also because of the way the psychology of how these martial arts work in my training. I tend to look at these situations under the topic of how do we remain in harmony. And it's easy to remain in harmony when everything is chingon, as we say in New Mexico. When everything's easy and everything's correct and everything's in its place, when we could say, yin and yang is balanced and there's a more or less a harmonious situation going on, that's when things are easy. Humans have an impulse, which is natural, I suppose, to not want to look at conflict, to not want to look at violence, to not want to look at the times when the balance is broken, that balance between the yin and the yang, for example. So unfortunately, what that can do is blind us to the dynamics that are engaged then, and that can inhibit our ability to deal with something. It's very hard to deal with something if you're wincing and cringing and not looking at it with both eyes. And I referred before to when I'm in a violent situation, my mentality is what? Because I want to engage that other half of the brain that is the body brain, that's the movement brain, that's the pattern recognition, the brain that that lets plugs in with how things flow together in unity, as opposed to the brain that picks things apart. But if you get pushed out of that state of balance by fear and desire, the whip and the carrot, attraction and aversion, if we leave bewilderment to the side for now, right? And so the higher your capacity, the higher your development, the the better your ability to reharmonize disharmonious situations. But you don't do that by running away from it. You do that by moving into it. Okay. Uh, but you have to have skill. You have to really have skill to be able to do that. You kind of have to know what you're doing. Okay. So the wonderful Buddhist reference to this. It's one of the stories I truly love. It's a little gruesome. It's the story of Angulimala. Okay. Angulimala. means anguli, it means fingers, and you know how mala, we have mala beads? So this is Angulimala was a dude who had a necklace of human fingers, and he was a member of a cult in and there's a bizarre story behind it, like his teacher didn't like him because he thought he was after his wife, and so he gave him this weird charge or, this weird, requirement that he had to fulfill that had to do with killing 999 people or something like that, and so the fingers were the scoreboard that he was using to keep these fingers up. So, he lives in this forest where he captures people on their way from A to B. He's in the middle in the forest, and, the
Like a
Buddha.
Grimm's fairy tale.
It
He's
is, it
the
really
ogre.
is. Oh, it is. And but the Buddha the story is so wonderful, though. So the Buddha, he's happening along, but being the Buddha, he is equipped with mystic vision. And being the Buddha, he doesn't want people to accumulate negative karma. He wants to lift up the human race, and so we have to purge off all this negative karma. We have to burn it off. We have to go through the transformation. And so, with his mystic vision, he sees Angulimala out there, and he sees that the next person walking through the forest that Angulimala is going to kill is Angulimala's own mother. And she's gonna be like number 1,000 or something that'll finish his. And the Buddha knows that matricide is like, wow, ta bad karma is killing for sure, but matricide and patricide is like the worst of the worst. So he doesn't want Angulimala, even though he's not a positive person, he doesn't want him to increase his negative karma by killing his own mother. So he decides he's gonna intervene. So he's trucking around, through, this area where Angulimala hangs out, and he's gotta go from A to B where Angulimala hangs out in the middle. And so he starts to go out into the forest, and all of his disciples are like, "We're not going in there. You know what the deal is with Angulimala. He keeps collecting fingers of people for God's sake." So the Buddha's like, "Yeah, that's okay. I'll meet you at B," right? "You guys go around the forest. I'll go through the forest. It'll work out, trust me." So sure enough, he goes through the forest. The disciples are like, "Yeah, whatever. We'll see you there, hopefully." You have to wonder if they had a little side bet action going, right? So so the Buddha goes through, and sure enough, apparently in time to prevent the matricide, he encounters Angulimala. Now, this is one of the reasons that I love this story, okay? The style that I was taught was from a master who was a champion of Korea who was known as the Stepping King. And his ability to control distance was unbelievable. I mean, just amazing. In fact, my teacher told me that my teacher was like his protege, and part of the protege's job was to wash the uniforms. And so he said he'd look at Cho's uniform, and always under his arm was always dirty. And he's trying to figure out, why is this always dirty? And then he's watching closer and he sees that Cho, one of Cho's great things is he puts it out there, and then you shoot at him, and then he just is away, but he's away by parts of an inch. So you can get your dirty foot on his cloth, but you could never touch his body. But you, of course, had exposed everything by that shot. So it was, so so it had to do with this stepping king. And we say that it's like a dog fights a bear. If you watch the bear, he's definitely got more power. He's definitely not a problem to face a wolf toe to toe. But the wolf is no idiot. The wolf is a stepping king, right? The wolf controls distance. The wolf has so much superiority and mobility that most of the time he can be out of there, and maybe the bear just gets the fur, but he doesn't get the wolf, and that's that idea. So, back to the story with Angulimala, Buddha encounters Angulimala, who, being Angulimala, just immediately attacks him. And this is where the sutra, I wish if there were this is one of those places in history I would love to be a fly on the wall. If I could go back, like, when the time machine comes out, this is on my list for sure. And so Angulimala keeps trying to hit the Buddha, and he can't get him. Try as he might, he can't hit him or capture him, right? So, finally, he gets so frustrated, he shouts, "Stop." And the Buddha says, "No, you stop." Right? And they have an encounter, which I don't believe there's much in the sutra that tells us exactly what was that energetic, psycho-spiritual encounter like. Uh, but anyway, they have their encounter. The Buddha makes it through the forest. They come out at location B. All of the disciples are there. They're all sitting down to a meal. They notice that the Buddha has another disciple with him, shaved head, everything. And the Buddha says, "Oh, yeah, I want you to meet our new disciple, his Gulimala." And they all run away. And then apparently they figured out, okay, he's not the same Angulimala. Now he's been transformed somehow, right? So there is this idea that if you're pure enough, if you know what I call the Buddha path, I have this idea in my head I call the Buddha path. It's like, there was this bumper sticker that was going around, what would Jesus do? And then it became, what would X do? What would Y do? And everybody had a shot at it. Well, way before that, I always had this idea that whatever the situation was, there is somehow the thing that the Buddha would do to resolve that situation. And here I'm using the Buddha in an ideal sense, right? Not necessarily limited to the historical Buddha, but you can imagine it that way. So I always ask myself in any difficult situation, what is the Buddha path here? What is the response that reestablishes harmony? The Taoists have this idea that humans are in partnership with heaven and earth. And so part of that partnership is finding this harmony. So for example, uh, if you have there have been situations where something heavy was gonna go down once at the bar, and I was across the street, and, the bar was nearly empty, and there was some very strange guy, and he was
Wait, this is when you were a bouncer or this is at your school?
oh, this is down in Madrid.
Oh, okay.
Within the past 10 years, say.
Gotcha.
And one of the guys came and he said, "Hey, this guy's really strange, we don't know what's gonna." And so a few of us went over,
I was actually one of them. We were at the holler and we went over and
and we just sat next to him, right?
yeah, yeah.
And we just smiled, and we just kinda went into it like, "Okay, what is this?" And nobody got heavy with him. We didn't get into a macho battle of, "What are you doing? How are there was no basic primate psychology. All there was, "We're here now. So now whatever, we're a factor in this formula, and that changes everything." And so whatever the intent was, whatever the situation was, with no harsh words spoken, with no just a big smile. I mean, I did sit down right next to him. Uh, but he just, I think it was what, 3, 4, 5 minutes, and he went off because he had some other business somewhere. So that's the best case scenario. Uh, Worst case scenario is another fun story where we were when we had the kung fu school. I don't know if you're you familiar with this story, but basically we were letting the kids do break dancing and stuff in the school in the evenings, and so we had what I guess it was a breakdance battle, and they did their rap stuff and the microphone stuff, and it was very cool, and there was a lot of people there. And, in Santa Fe, there are different youth groups that sometimes have an uneasy peace based on territorial imperatives. So so it turns out that there were 2 youth from opposing youth groups, and there was some bad blood behind them, and, it was just on the verge of getting physical. My oldest son was in between them, trying to communicate to them that this was not gonna go well to try to brawl in my dad's kung fu school, kind of a gauntlet, right? And I made my way through the crowd to that scene just as one of them was launching back to try to sail a haymaker over my son onto the target. Okay, pretty predictable. So he got all the way into the launch position when I came up behind him and I had him in the sleeper. The sometimes they call it the lion killer, and he was just captured. I just captured the headquarters, which is a strategy I've used before. And then I just keel hauled him out the door. And none of this part of the story is necessarily significant or carrying a teaching lesson. Okay. But so I got him out of the door. He let him go. He goes racing off. Of course, he's pissed. And then, a bunch of people follow us out. And so I immediately said to one of the kids that I knew him, I said, please go find him and tell him this. Tell him I apologize to him because I know he was standing up for his homie and that what he was doing was honorable within his world, but I can't have people brawling in my kung fu school. So tell him I apologize that I had to do that, but no hard feelings. So about 2 or 3 hours go by, and then he comes back and he apologizes to me for having tried to cause ruckus in my school. Okay? So a way to interpret that is this thing went down, X went down, violence went down, and in that case, I had to yang him hard and fast. Just shut him down. But because I yanged him so hard, I had to imbalance the situation now. I had actually set the pendulum swinging harder maybe than it was. And my school had all these big glass windows in the front, right? All night long. And so knowing that I had further pushed things in that yang direction, I knew I immediately had to do a big yin, right? I couldn't send a message and you tell him if he ever tries that stuff again, well, that would be the continuing the yang push. I already pushed hard and I surprised him when I did. He was totally powerless. Like this was a big impact, a big yang. So I had to I had to add yin in there. I had to apologize. I had to recognize his position. Yeah, I know within your worldview, you were doing an honorable thing. You're standing up for your homie. And I know that within that chess game, you were following even though I don't agree with the way these youth groups interact, I know that within their world, there is a way things are set up. But so I wanted to pay that out. I didn't expect he was going to come back and apologize to me. But when he did, I knew that the balance was reestablished. Yin and yang had now been rebalanced. And I maybe had rapport with that kid now that I didn't have before that because I was able to go through that violent situation and transcend it. But if I hadn't been at the level to be able physically to do that and mentally, psychologically to understand the dynamics that were at work, I would not have been able to resolve that, and I could have been collateral damage in that conflict. Okay. So that's just like a little way in effigy to show that balancing of things, because we know that when we get into a yang, 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 yang situation, we never that doesn't resolve. That's not modeled on how nature resolves these things. So, does that
Yeah.
help? I mean, does that shine some light around in the huge dark room that
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is?
yeah. No, I think there are some interesting threads here. One thing that comes up for me is I was surprised in the story about the Buddha. You've told me that story before, but I had forgotten that, like Cho, the Buddha knows how to fight. Um,
Oh, yeah. He was an
and
expert martial artist.
well, I think that probably is worth talking more about. Um, and um, because I don't know where I got this mental model, but I think kind of from growing up in the 70s and 80s and just like the sort of thing they were teaching in schools those days. There were some there was a core curriculum, like don't judge a book by its cover. That was like a post-racial
Sure.
worldview. And
Yeah.
then there was this like pacifist worldview that I remember learning about in school. Gandhi was great because he refused to
Right.
participate, right?
During
Which
the
I've
awakening.
since heard is not entirely the only take on Gandhi. But
Well,
I was curious to
Gandhi
hear.
also said, just to interject, that being weak and not being able to be violent in your own defense is not nonviolence. That's
Yeah,
just weakness, and you don't have the possibility of violence. It's when you have the possibility of violence and then you choose nonviolence, that's nonviolence. So that
that's something that Jordan Peterson's been saying a lot, and I think it's a really good message for folks to hear that you want to be a dangerous man. I think is the way he puts it,
yeah,
and you want to be able to be in full control of the extent to which you're a dangerous man,
yeah.
um,
Mhm.
so that you have the capacity for violence.
Right, right.
Yeah,
You can't be a noodle.
yeah.
And, but you have to have that balance. In Shaolin, when we do this is the sun and this is the moon. Those together create the character for Ming, which means bright or brilliant.
Well,
But there's
and this
also
is yang and this is yin, I think is worth saying.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, and that there is a natural balance in those things. And so, the other thing that we didn't get into is in that state, when one is in the moment, if one is operating at that highest level of where both brain spheres are functioning, you're operating in a condition that the Taoists would say they would call it wei wu wei, or doing not doing, right? So that there's this idea that our action happens like a ripe fruit falls from a tree, you know? If you ever go back to we've mentioned before Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Well, he wrote that sort of reprising the idea of a book by Eugene Herrigel called Zen and the Art of Archery. And in Zen of the Art of Archery, he talks about the mystery of the Zen archer and the master archer who takes him in the end of this book, he takes him into the archery hall at night, dark, without any lights. He puts an arrow in the bullseye and then he splits the arrow that's in the bullseye, right? So some kind of mastership going on there. And so there is this idea that, the master says when the arrow is loosed, it's like a ripe fruit falls from the tree. Uh, these people are very much in a state where there is the idea that they're not breathing anymore. The Tao is breathing them, right? I might have mentioned earlier this idea, this great Taoist idea of Hun Yuan Qi, this energy that is the energy that coordinates all of the timings of nature and generates the seasons and generates the interrelations and the interweavings of how nature works. And so there's this idea that when our brain spheres are synchronized or working the way they're supposed to, then we are moved by the Hunyuan Chi. We're moved by the will of heaven. We're moved by the dynamics that move Earth, and we're then a partner with heaven and Earth. And so then, you know, when I move into a fighting situation, I wanna be in this situation of what? The situation of openness, the situation where I can flow, not a situation uh, of frenzied roof brain chatter fueled by fear or anger or rage or desire. I wanna be able to drift into that and dance with it in a hollow way, if you will, in an empty way, so that when the situation wants me to move, I move. When the situation wants me to stick, I stick. When the situation calls for this, that's the only way that I have that I know in that situation to find the Buddha path, right?
It's very much like singing an ikaro in a ceremony.
It is exactly the same thing. And that's why I think when we do that, we can be telepathic in doing that. Some other circuits are,
I mean,
it is about
actually,
expanded awareness.
when you're saying, "The situation wants me to move, I move. The situation wants me to stick, I stick," is actually a description of telepathy. That's what that is.
And it's like when I wanna know what helper I need to work in this situation, I don't theorize logically, I call. And then when I call the Icaro that I need, I've mentioned before, like the golf club jumping out of the bag. Uh, the Icaro that I need rises out of the the plenum, to borrow Jung's word.
And you see other people are in relationship to the same dynamic with the bag, right? The golf club jumping out of the bag is also an experience that other people in the room, like in the fighting situation, it would be other people in the fight, or in a ceremony, other people going through whatever trip they're going through. You see when the golf club jumps out of the bag how those trips are interwoven, and that golf club is relevant around the room in various surprising ways.
La maravilla del mundo.
Well, yeah,
Claro, claro.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So, so I'm wondering if there's more to be said about kind of the morality of violence, because in a way we're talking about that from an Eastern philosophical standpoint, that kind of violence, if you are merely a vessel for what needs to happen, then you don't have any moral responsibility for what unfolds, right? It's just kind of unfolding and you're part of the unfolding. Um, and that also implies a really high state of consciousness that might
Yep.
not be available to everybody all the time. And so even while we might be asking what would the Buddha do, um, are there other kind of like ways you would talk to young students about the morality of violence,
Mhm.
or or did my question at the beginning kind of about politics being a stand-in for violence, or civilization itself being a proxy for violence, bring up any material?
Well, or I could argue that violence is a proxy for civilization too. We could turn it around that way. Um, I think, it's very circumstantial, dependent, right? Circumstantially dependent. Um, I do think, like you hear some of the stories of some of these martial artists going to war, and they're described like ring wraiths because nature is unkind and treats people like sacrificial straw dogs, and the sage is unkind and treats people like sacrificial straw dogs. And if there is a perfection there, there may be a karma-free way of dealing with that. The way that, traditionally in martial arts, they give you a little scale. I remember when I learned this, it had little drawings of little dudes, and obviously, the lowest level on morality is just to attack somebody, smite them unprovoked. Uh, it's considered, you know, a little bit better if you smite them. Well, it's not much better if you provoke them to provoke you.
Uh-huh.
Come at me, bro. you know, or you cause them to righteously, you know, attack you for some reason. And there are ways that you could say that. There are legally things that are considered fighting words, I think,
Legally.
Uh, and this is where, maybe the idea of aggravation gets in there, right?
Oh,
And but that's not considered much better, you know. If I provoke somebody to swing on me, and then I can say, "Well, he swung on me first," and then I beat the tar out of him. Uh, it's not much better than just beating the tar out of them, right? But it is considered maybe they did have an off ramp. They could have chosen to not take the bait and walk away. Whereas if you just attack them, presumably they didn't, right? And then the next level is they attack you and you smite them. You didn't provoke them, but you didn't save their life either, right? You They attack you, and the rule that I typically had when I was back in the day when you ran a kung fu school. I think I opened up my school in 1980. Um, it was not uncommon for people from other schools to show up and want to fight with you just to see what you had. These days, it was not yet the heyday of the kindergarten babysitting school. So there was still an idea that this is a martial art. You should be able to do some martial stuff with it. And I always had a policy in those days, however hard it comes, that's how hard it goes back. And if they're, I fought with some Japanese teachers, and it was very formal and very respectful, and they weren't trying to beat the tar out of me, and I was the same way. And so there is this idea of mirror like Zen, right? Where you're reflecting. And so, I've tended to use that as a scale, but at the highest levels, the level of higher morality is he attacks you unprovoked and you ward him off. You maybe school him a little bit. You maybe cause a little educational physical pain, but you don't do any permanent damage. And the little picture I remember is the dude on his ass with his sword stuck in the sand and the other guy standing over him going, right? And so, but again, that's a measure of personal power. When we watch prize fighters, we want them to be within the same very small weight range. We want them to be very close to the same skill, and and because that's the most entertaining fight, right? But the more the differential in skill, the less entertaining the fight becomes. I'm recall of I was sitting in a place years ago in Madrid and witnessed these 2 guys, who really had some bad blood between them, and they decided it was going down here and now. And they decided to do this in front of me and one of my advanced students, who were, sitting on a park bench or a picnic bench, and they were like 10 or 12 feet away, but they were on gravel. And these guys really wanted to do some damage to each other, and so they loaded up from as far back in left field as they could, and they threw for all they were worth, but they had no training. And so being on gravel, it was like we were gonna intervene because I don't know who's right or who's wrong, but I just won't let one person deal out a bloodbath beating to another person in my presence. I'm sorry, that's just a thing for me. There's a whole backstory to that, right? But, so we were getting ready to intervene, and then we noticed that nobody could land anything on the other guy. They were just violently throwing their own selves on the ground because there was gravel there and they couldn't root. And so everything was just crazy. And so we were about to intervene, and then we sat back and said, "No, this is actually we're gonna watch this for a while," you know? And then if anybody started to really get over, we'd have to stop it, you know? But in this case, the skill level was so low, there also wasn't a fight, really. Um, but in general, if there's a big differential, your moral obligation is to use that differential to protect both parties. And
So
then
oh,
if
go
you've
ahead.
developed any, introspective, insightful, personality, character oomph, you should be using that to kinda go in and, what needs to be reoriented here, reframed, but that's a tall order. And that's like you're getting to master level stuff. This is not something the average person does. And then if we add a multiplier and we start looking at large groups of people interacting, there's an entirely different psychology that goes on with that. And that's a deep and muddy pit. Um,
Well, maybe let's see if we're gonna end up back to that. Um,
with the
be
politics angle.
Yeah, because the question that's coming up for me is along the lines of, where does this belief I have come from about violence begets violence? And before we hit the record button today, we were talking about abuse a little bit, and I think you said something like any anytime you end up in a relationship with someone who's been abused, you are going to be abused somehow. It's going to emerge somehow. And with the caveat that people can heal and people can do their work and process that stuff. But to the degree that it's unprocessed, that abuse gets revivified through other relationships. And I think
Or
that's
the imbalance. It might not look like the original abuse,
of course,
but the
the
imbalance
effect of it is gonna show up,
that
and I think
imbalance
that's
is gonna track, sure,
and I think that's also a description of what a psychic parasite is.
sure,
That like what shamans work on, is essentially a abuse. Well, one of the things is abuse being passed from one person to another in these different form factors. Um,
right.
but
And the
but
way
my
we break that cycle is by climbing that ladder of consciousness and awareness and gaining those skills and insight and all that, yeah, as a brief
Yeah,
interjection.
like, but in the shamanic context, I don't think, um, responding to psychic violence, if you will, with psychic violence, I don't think I've ever really had any useful experience with that. I've tried it, and I think it does beget violence,
It
whereas
does,
finding the
and
way
it
to
expends you,
universal.
it exhausts you,
Yeah.
it costs you hugely.
So healing coming from, accessing something more like universal love or whatever you wanna call it. Like, I guess I'm wanting to apply that outside of the shamanic context too, and I guess I
Yeah.
keep finding that here in the physical world, there is a place for violence. That's kind of like how this is going.
Oh, sure, sure. Unfortunately, that's true. That's why I figure when we're years later, when we're in the universal galactic bar and we tell people that we were on planet Earth during this time period, we're gonna get a lot of free drinks. Let's put it that way. Right? And a lot of like, "Oh, wow, okay." Uh, I do think, we are in this process of trying to wake up maybe very slowly, and there's a lot of gnashing of teeth. And that is that idea of sort of burning off karma. Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. Um, like I said before, you're here, you're wearing this meat suit, you're gonna go through some stuff. But it's go throughable stuff, no matter how it appears to you. And that's like the great lesson of the Bhagavad Gita. It's like, yeah, it's not really the way it looks. So This is all process. It's all process, and you're going to learn along the way. Consciousness is going to expand along the way. Um, so, um, yeah, I mean, how we live together is, in many ways, it is the big question. I think even Lao Tzu talked about that. How do I balance my own personal interest with the interest of everyone around me? And we've seen so many variations on the theme. We've seen all the different imbalances, and like there's a lot of argumentation about this system of government or that system of government. There's a lot of complications about interests that are associated with those different systems of government. But honestly, the conclusion that I've come to, I call myself a radical anarchist or a philosophical anarchist. By radical, I mean getting to the root. Okay, is that original idea of radical? And the idea behind philosophical anarchism is it says that if you have onboarded the master, then you won't have a master need to manifest outside. But if you haven't onboarded a certain level of mastering of yourself, then a master is going to show up outside of you and you're going to be subject to that master. So that there is a parity or a balancing between the inner world and the outer world. If everyone lives so that the police never get called because every problem is resolved without police getting called, then the institution of police may pass away. But you can't say we shouldn't have police until you have made them obsolete by your own spiritual progress. Uh, Otherwise, you're just looking to find a situation where you have no master and you have no intention of being your own master. And then that just brings us back to all of the culpas upon culpas where we have engendered suffering for each other. Uh, this is one of the things about the Bodhisattvic vow. Uh, uh, I had one experience where I was out on the mesa and I was looking across at the city and all the lights of the city, and I know the buzz, what the Taoists and the Buddhists will call the whirring of the cicadas in the 10 bulls, that buzz of humanity. And through my momentary illuminated vision, I was able to grasp the repetitive cycle of human suffering that we've caused each other. And I honestly have come to the conclusion that there is no external means for regulating ourselves to live well and fulfillingly amongst each other. It's an internal thing that has to happen. And we need to lose a lot. We need to, like I said before, we need to lose our pesky caterpillar ways before we're going to manifest as a butterfly. I don't think we can expect other people to do this for us. I think it has to be the product of personal development. So we'll know we're on the right track when we create a world that encourages that kind of development, and where we're in a reinforcing loop for that. We're not out of this other kind of loop yet, though. But we're really getting our, like, the old way they used to train dogs. When the dog poops on the carpet, you take his nose and you put him in. Did you do that? That's probably the old school way. But the new media, the information technology is showing ourselves to ourselves in dimensions and in just in ways that was never possible before. We are coming to know ourselves with an incredible rate, and as people note, it's not all pretty. Um, but there's a process here, right? And I'm hoping that this is grist for the mill of us, of our self-reflexive consciousness, helping us become more aware and tuning our behaviors and becoming participants on a bigger level, you know, so
I have like a problem. I think it's a completely unfounded belief that the um that we have a tendency to want to avoid suffering, right? We want to, for example, avoid political systems that are profoundly oppressive and murderous. Um, and on the other hand, um, I think my belief is that the more we experience the oppressive, or the more we experience um, the division, or the suffering, in whatever form, the greater is the potential energy that precedes the kinetic energy of consciousness evolution. That like when we're, I almost don't want to say it, but when we're in the death camps, there is this potential for enlightenment, and there's a letting off the hook there that I'm not proposing at all, right?
yep, yep,
Um,
yep.
and
No, I get
and
it.
in one of the quotes you've shared a couple of times about, those who are being killed or mistaken, and those who are doing the killing are mistaken,
Yeah.
or um,
Bhagavad Gita.
yeah, there's a potential letting off the hook there, right? There's well, then might as well kill, or
Right.
embrace hedonism, whatever
Yeah.
that looks like.
It's not a letting off because karma still exists.
So yeah,
It
maybe
just
say
says
more
that
about your
there's
model for
even a
that.
deeper reality behind that maybe. Um, uh, well, I mean, give me say a little more where you want me to drill down in particular.
Well, what you last said about there's still karma. So there's not a letting off the hook. Um, I think that might be worth explaining more. And
But being
then
on the hook is ultimately okay in the final analysis maybe.
yeah, I mean you can keep zooming out, right? And see it all as integrative.
There's a universe you can't fall out of.
Right. And then if you want, you could also say more about do you agree that as the suffering increases, the potential for illumination does too? The potential energy also increases in the system? Because you kind of implied that when you were talking about through information technology, our ability to experience ourselves is increasing manifold. And that
Right,
seems like it has potential in it, even though we're experiencing this as a loss of meaning, a division between people that seems irreconcilable. Like
right.
people are not connected to one another, to themselves, to source. Like there's some suffering going
That's the
on.
popular story.
Well, go on.
But when I was in Uganda and we were trying to, we had the one little girl, Josephine, and we got her some surgery, and she's now, thank God, happy and healthy and, wants to be a doctor, and,
Makes sense.
hey, Josephine, if you ever see this, I'm so proud of you. Uh, but, we also had a little kid named Emmanuel, and we weren't there in time for Emmanuel, and people in this town cried for Emmanuel. I had to go to there and visit his family and visit his grave, and there was a real connection there, and people in this town really felt that, and so, yeah, it's just ones and zeros. Yeah, it's just, you know, electrical impulses, but it was a big aha for me when I got that human connection could move through that. That people would care about people that were so very different than themselves, that their hard lives and their suffering was real to them, and that was an aha for me, and that's why I wanna push that, because I know that that can happen, and I know this is the kind of deep knowing. There's some problems that we can solve, with our heads, and there's some problems that we have to solve with our heads and our hearts and our bellies too. And this is part of that. So I'm really holding out very high hopes for this new nervous system. If people are like this all the time, that's okay. If I can use that to open up their hearts, if 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 that extension into human experience can reach farther into other, then this is an unfolding of our potential. Then this is some butterfly shit. This isn't just, oh, all of our worst impulses. No, all of our impulses are here. The good, the bad, the mediocre, the completely irrelevant. It's all there. There's pictures of people's lunch, for God's sakes, right? But that doesn't mean that that's all that there is, right?
There's also cats.
Many cats, and I like cats, and so that's good. Uh, and bears. I'm very partial to bears too,
Yeah.
but we can go into that on another topic. But this idea that it's an extension of humans. It's not humans becoming machines. It's humans becoming bigger humans, more extended humans, which means that all of our human capacities can extend. Yes, our greed can extend, but so can our compassion. So the question is, what do we want to fill our lives up with? We are at a point where, I think Fritjof Capra in The Turning Point says, this could bring the millennia, is what they used to talk about with this idea of the bringing heaven on earth. Like we can program what we're going to see, but we have to do that by being more conscious, more aware, and to do that, we have to extend ourselves, right? We have to extend out of ourselves, and we have to use all of ourselves to do that, right? So maybe that went off into the mists and became too sfumato, but there's definitely something there, and it isn't just an intellectual content, and that's my point. That's my
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, you made that point well, I think. And I went to the hospital in Kampala with you and Emmanuel the first time, right? When
Mhm.
we were trying to treat him, and
When we thought we could save him.
yeah, and I wasn't expecting a conversation about violence to turn to grief, but it makes sense.
Natural bedfellows.
Yeah, right, and that kind of speaks to karma also, right? That
And that's why we celebrate the victory of a war like a funeral, right? So who wants to win? Who wants to win like that, right? The point is there are other paths, and as humans, we're capable of those. But we have to measure up. We have to transform our understanding of things. We have to look at our attachments. We have to look at our fears and our desires. We have to step up, right? Uh, if you're not for you, then who is? But if you're only for you, then who are you? And most importantly, if not now, when? Right?
it's Hillel.
Thank you, Rabbi Hillel.
Yeah,
Right?
good. I think let's leave it there.
Yeah, yeah. Lots of places. I mean, we'll be back
Yeah.
to this for sure.
Thank you, Brian.
Wonderful. We'll see. We'll see everybody next time.